Bullshit.
The No BS Marketing Show is brought to you by Laramore's men's and women's designer clothing. Free shipping, free returns. Shop men's and women's designer clothing, shoes, accessories, jewelry, and more online at laramores.com or in-store downtown Pittsburgh. It's the No BS Marketing Show. I'm your host, Dave Mastovich of Mass Solutions. Our guest today is Jane Werner, Executive Director, Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. But first, let's cut the BS. I was interviewed for a piece in Entrepreneur Magazine tied to decision fatigue, a topic which I've written and spoke about. The conversation turned to how I juggle multiple roles, including CEO, thought leader, content creator, Vistage member, basketball coach, and my most important role, that of being a dad to Alec, Brevin, and Carter. My initial answer was, I don't. I kind of laughed because I struggle with decision fatigue just like the rest of us. There's also a symptom called decision avoidance, which hampers productivity and personal and professional growth. But the interviewer left a lengthy pause and said, if you didn't know how to work around decision fatigue, you wouldn't be where you are today. Take a moment and think about what might help others. Now, that's a good interviewer. She didn't let me off the hook and nudge me along in a positive manner. Well, as our loyal No BSers know, once I get started, it might be tough to shut me up, so I'll give you one or two of my answers here and save the rest for episode 2 with Jane. I think the biggest thing that reduces my decision fatigue is something I learned as a teenager. It's worked for me, but it isn't for everyone necessarily. My approach is to only focus significant time on things I'm really passionate about. The key there is significant time. It's okay to try new things and see what you like and don't like, but I don't mess around and put a lot of time into anything that doesn't inspire me. I figure if I'm going to do something, it better be something I enjoy and something I can get good at. So throughout my life at any given time or phase, I've only spent serious time on things I loved and was willing to work hard at and commit to achieving some level of mastery. As a teenager and through college, that was playing sports, particularly basketball was a focus. Then I moved into coaching basketball at a young age, and I slowly reduced how much I played hoops and put that extra time into coaching. I loved music and partying as a teenager, so I became a DJ. Then I got better at it and began working on the air at a bunch of radio stations. Guess what? I came back to that when I started this podcast 200 plus episodes ago. I love interviewing people and enjoy the rush of doing a radio show that's now radio on demand through podcast. This ties to my current role as thought leader, content creator. I started creating comic books with my brother and my buddy Mike Minnow when we were little kids. Then as a teenager, I made sure my friends didn't know that I read a bunch of books and wrote shit because I was afraid that they'd think I was a geek or get on my case. Hey, it's how I grew up. Guys played sports, partied, went after girls, reading books, writing, nah, not where I grew up. I've always loved business, so I went that route and moved up the corporate ladder. But then I decided to start my own company. I'm on every minute that I work on Mass Solutions. It's stressful, but man, I love the work and this company. But most important, when my first son, as he likes to write when signing a birthday card to me, when Alec was born, a major passion became raising my sons, Alec, Brevin, and Carter. So what's the main way I overcome decision fatigue? I focus significant time on only things that I'm passionate about, and that enables me to get better at those things, which builds confidence in doing those things, which leads to success doing those things. Other than being a dad, no dad's certain that they're doing the right thing half the time, but loving your kids covers up a lot of that uncertainty. Your takeaway, cut the BS, reduce the time you spend on things that you're not passionate about. Focus more time on the stuff you love so you can get better at that stuff. And if you don't love what you're doing for a living, you need to change that because work is at least a third of your life. Someone that loves what she's doing and you can just tell the passion when you meet her is our guest, Jane Werner, who in her role as Executive Director of the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh leads the team responsible for all aspects of the museum's mission and vision, exhibits, public programming, funding, and operations. Jane, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Have you been hit with decision fatigue ever, where it's sort of like this all started from when I loved the Snickers Hangry commercials and researched decision fatigue and started writing and speaking about it a little bit. And so I talk a lot about how decision fatigue, we as executives make so many decisions that we have to minimize how many we make or it ends up stifling our productivity. Any ideas on that? Any thoughts?
Well,
Yeah, I think everybody kind of gets there at some point where you just are walking down the street and you think, I cannot make another decision today. But, the thing that I think works well is when you actually have people who work with you, who can help you make decisions and that you trust to make those decisions. And I think at the museum, I'm fortunate enough to work with the most amazing people who not only help me make decisions, but make decisions on their own that are good decisions. And that, it's nice to have that trust among a group of people.
Trust is absolutely huge. And if we could probably spend a couple of episodes talking about all the different ways to try to reduce decision fatigue. I threw out the one on focus. When we go into episode 2, I'll talk about a couple minor tactics to reduce your decision fatigue individually. But I agree completely that delegation and leadership and working as a team is a huge way to reduce that decision fatigue.
Yeah, and I think you actually do have to make some just really easy decisions, Like sometimes when you have really hard decisions to make, I like to mix it up with some easy decisions so that you think, okay, well, that's done. Okay, well, that's done. Okay, now let's focus on this really tough problem before you go back to the easy decisions.
Good point, because when you make those small ones, you get that sense of accomplishment, build some momentum.
That's right. That's right. And why not? Why not make the easy decisions? Just to know that, you can still continue to make decisions.
If you're a checker, which I jokingly talk a lot about checkers, I'm a checker, so I make lists all the time, and you get that satisfaction of checking off the list. So as you're saying, when you make those somewhat easy decisions, then move to the moderate ones, you've checked a lot off, you're feeling satisfaction.
Yeah. And I don't like to make any big decisions in the morning. I always like to... I'm an afternoon person. That's where I kind of hit my stride. So I like to do all the easy stuff in the morning.
That self-awareness is huge. And I think a lot of people generally have that self-awareness of when they're at their peak, but I don't think most people are disciplined enough to actually act on it. I do the same thing. I'm the opposite, like 10 to 11:30 is when I'm at my best. Notice the podcasts are taped at 10 o'clock. Mm-hmm. So yours is the afternoon.
Yeah. So who knows how this podcast is going to go?
Hey, I might be on my game and you might not.
Oh, I might be way off.
so far you've been on your game, and so I like it. So I like to start the show with the question about talking about your career path and your journey, because I've found many interesting stories. Many leaders haven't had the chance, because when they're interviewed on the media or when they're quoted in a blog post, it's just a brief amount of time, and you have to get that answer in quickly. So I try to make sure that the show starts with you talking about your career path, and you have as much time as you want to give the listeners something that they can learn from.
Yeah, well, my career path is all kind of a series of mistakes, probably, or a series of events that I never in my wildest imagination did I think I'd become the director of a children's museum when I was in college. So it was kind of an unusual situation where I went to college to become a journalist. And within a month, I called home, and my dad, who was a steel worker, who was actually, was restoring 1965 Mustangs so I could go to college. I called him and said, I really want to be an art major. And he said to me, I've worked all these years in a job I've hated. Just do what you love. And you know how to live on nothing. So if you want to be an artist and live on nothing, go for it. So that's what I did. And I went back to college and eventually ended up with a degree in art education, because I do have a practical streak in me. Actually, I have a degree in synesthetic art education, which is... it was a very 1970s, 80s, early 80s degree program where we were looking at putting a lot of different subject matters into the art classroom. But I was certified to teach art, which I soon realized I hated. So I did not like being in the classroom. It was just a management of kids, which I didn't particularly like doing. So one thing led to the next. I mean, it's a long, long story, but I had been working in New York on Wall Street.
Well, how did you get that job after being the art teacher?
Again, it's a long story. In the middle of all this, I took a year off of college and went to New York, and I had a boyfriend who was living in New York. So we had this really tiny apartment on East 82nd Street with another friend of ours. And I looked for a job, and I was good at math, and I got this job at Daiwa Securities, which was a Japanese brokerage firm that was in the Merrill Lynch Towers. And I always think about this. It was just, I was the only American in the office. Everyone else was Japanese. So that's where I learned to eat sushi. They would bring sushi in, and it was in the, I guess, let's see, what would have been like the late 70s, early 80s. And Mr. Sumi was my boss. And it was I learned a lot about the Japanese culture because I would keep the expense reports for the office. And if I would make a mistake, Mr. Sumi would actually correct the mistake for me without telling me. So I kept saying to him, I'm never going to learn this if you don't actually show me the mistakes that I made. But he said, oh, no. And I could never quite understand that until a friend of mine who also worked there, a Japanese woman, said, he doesn't want to dishonor you. He doesn't want to disgrace you. So you're just going to have to figure this out because he's never going to tell you when you make a mistake. Now, I thought that was such an interesting management technique. But after a year of doing that, I actually went back to college and finished up my degree and then moved to Pittsburgh because I had an aunt and uncle who lived out here. And I thought I would just see if I could find a job. And then I found 3 jobs. And so I worked as a film editor at WQED. I demonstrated a graphic arts computer at Buell Science Center at the time, Buell Planetarium at the time. And I sold Samsonite luggage. And the Samsonite, I was such a success at selling Samsonite luggage that it was the #1 Samsonite luggage seller. And I got a whole set. And the thing that put me over the top was Cliff Stout, who was a quarterback for the Steelers.
Yes.
The night before it was announced that he had been traded, he came in and bought a whole set.
There you go. The trade paid dividends for you.
It did. It was really kind of funny. So, one thing led to the next, and really the museum aspect of the job worked out. And I started to design exhibits for the Science Center. And then I went to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia and was the assistant director of exhibits there. Came back to Pittsburgh because my husband was here, and we commuted back and forth for 2 years, and started my own exhibit company when my first son was born. And came back to work at the Children's Museum as the director of exhibits and programs in 91, I think it was. I started there, and we were very small. And one thing led to the next, and in 99, I became director, and here I am all these years later at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. So that's it. That's the whole story.
You mentioned your first son. How many kids?
I have 2 sons.
Okay.
Ben and Matt. Matt actually just turned 25 yesterday, and Ben is 28. And they both live in Pittsburgh on the south side, slopes.
So talk about the way that whenever you had the 3 jobs, so you're the film editor at WQED and you're at Buell Planetarium at the time, and you started to design exhibits. So talk about that, because there's some of what we talk about on the show that's about leadership and communication. There's some passion coming out and some drive to do something and get better at it that ended up driving you towards this career. So when did you get that idea that, hey, I can design these exhibits, and start doing that at that first job when you had 3 jobs?
Well, it was really interesting because when I was in college, what I was terribly interested in, what I really got interested in, was the connection between art and science. Because I think that the processes that an artist goes through are the same processes that a scientist goes through. They're always questioning their model of the world. And I think that, actually, interestingly, children are doing the same thing. They're always questioning their model of the world. They're always saying, is this true? Is this what I believe? Almost exactly the way artists and scientists do. So I was always interested in that process. The Science Center at the time was on the verge of becoming Carnegie Science Center, Buell Science Center. So they were going from a planetarium to a science center, a little bit different. And they were looking to the Exploratorium in San Francisco, which is a art and science museum. So I was kind of perfect in that I was interested in art and science. I was kind of at the right place at the right time. So I was really interested in art and science. I was really interested in this process, and I didn't really know that much science, which was in some ways beneficial because I could go to scientists and I'd say, okay, we're looking at the physics of light, for example, or the physics of color. We did a big exhibit on color. And I would say, okay, is it like this? And I was like the visitor. I was like the person who really didn't know too much. And so it was this great conversation that I had with scientists to really understand what they were trying to get across. And then we would work together to come up with exhibits that would demonstrate it. And I learned so much. I was very fortunate to have a lot of people who were very kind to me to really try to explain what was going on in science. And so that's it became my passion, and still is to this day. I really love these connections between art and science. And it's kind of fascinating that we tend to kind of put these subject matters into silos when in fact, if we thought across disciplines, I think that we'd be much more creative in problem solving. And it's, you're talking to people that you don't normally talk to, right? How often do artists talk to scientists? And I think that just makes everybody a little bit more creative. And that's kind of why I kept pursuing that. We were just talking about this over at the museum. I was in my 20s and frankly, I loved the work. I would spend many, many, many hours at the Science Center, really trying to understand science and build things and test things out with visitors. It was real work. I was building things. I was, learning to use a router, and people were the guys, and they were all guys in the shop, would really teach me how to formica and how to actually do plumbing pipes. There was a whole exhibit that I wanted to do using plumbing pipes. And so they taught me how to solder. And it was just a really exciting and special time because we were so small that we could do anything that we want. We could experiment. And I had a good boss who was like allowing me to do that, who said, okay, go test things out, prototype things. So yeah, it was all kind of I was very lucky to be kind of put in that situation. And a small museum who aspires to do bigger things, I think is really a great way to start your career because you can experiment. You can be creative.
On a technical note, what's the difference between what was a planetarium? Are they still in existence? What was the shift?
Yeah, the planetarium, that was all about the stars and astronomy. So I'm sure there are many Pittsburghers who remember the Zeiss projector coming out of the floor of the Buell Planetarium. And you would learn about the cosmos. You would learn about astronomy. And it was really focused on the planets and planetary movements. And, it was... I can remember we actually projected the Challenger launch when it actually blew up, and we had a room full of kids. So it was that we were really always kind of looking to the stars. Science centers are all about introducing a lot of different subject matter that having to do with science. So then you get into physics, and you get into health, and you get into all the things that you find at the Carnegie Science Center now. It's a little bit different. It's not, and the planetarium is still at the Science Center, but they've introduced all the other subject matters. And we were doing that when we became Buell Science Center rather than Buell Planetarium.
Okay, so you talked about the art and science connection, how artists are similar to scientists and so are kids, that they're always questioning their model of the world. And then you mentioned you had this great boss who allowed you to prototype. So walk through how that progresses when you're at the planetarium, when it becomes the Science Center, and when do you actually make the move then to move towards the Children's Museum?
So we were working on a number of different exhibits at the time. I did a small exhibit called Scale Up, Scale Down, which was all about scale, obviously. But it was in conjunction with the Miniature Railroad, which is still at the Science Center. And that was quite a success, remarkably. I think I did it for $5,000 and interns from Edinburgh University. Believe it or not, we pulled that off. And that led to 3 exhibits that we did that were funded by Westinghouse that I kind of headed up. One was on color, one was on the physics of sports, and another was on sound. And they were 3 kind of temporary exhibits that kind of became semi-permanent at the Science Center. And there are many great stories about how we pulled that off. We did not have a lot of money, but we somehow managed to do 3 pretty good exhibits. It got kind of noticed by other people, and we were in the process of kind of putting the team together to take the Science Center from being at the Buell Science Center to become Carnegie Science Center. So I was in the initial team kind of planning the Carnegie Science Center. In the midst of all of that, I was offered this position at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, which I really couldn't pass up. It was just such a great position with great people, absolutely great people. But I had just gotten married, and my husband's business was here in Pittsburgh. So we actually made the commitment to do this long-distance marriage for a year. And I loved my job at the Franklin Institute. It was terrific. But after a year, I became pregnant. And so I went to my boss there and I said, I love this job, but I really have to go home. I'm having a baby. And he said, well, what can we do to keep you? And I said, well, you could fly me back and forth. And he said, okay. So this was 1989. Believe it or not, for a whole year, they flew me back and forth throughout my pregnancy. Ben was actually 8 months old, I think, when we opened, when I finally said, okay, that's enough of this. And I do think that Joel Bloom, who was the director of the Franklin Institute at the time, who was so committed to women in the Science Center field because there were so few, in a lot of ways, I owe a big debt to him. He was quite remarkable for his time, and that he was so committed to having women. So, Ben was my little frequent flyer. He was named for Ben Franklin because the Franklin Institute. And it was just a really special time. I don't know. So if you're looking for mentors, Joel Bloom, he was quite incredible for his time.
And after you left there, did you stay in touch with Joel?
Oh, yeah, for a while. Unfortunately, he passed away soon after I worked for him. He was a little bit older, and I don't know. He was a great guy. He was really. Now it's not such a big deal to work remotely, but then,
Unheard of.
Yeah, it was. We were faxing stuff back and forth to each other. They set up a fax machine in my house in Squirrel Hill, and I would fax things back and forth. And I can't quite explain it. Joel introduced me to Isaac Asimov. I would call Isaac Asimov and chit chat with him, and I was like 28 years old and 30 years old. I think back on it, it was just there I was in my little Squirrel Hill house, working away for the Franklin Institute, which is, I think it's the 3rd largest science center in the country, maybe even 2nd largest now. But it was he was quite an amazing guy.
You're listening to Jane Werner of the Children's Museum on the No BS Marketing Show. I appreciate family-owned businesses because I know how passionate they are about pleasing their customers. That's one more reason why I shop at Laramore's, a family-owned upscale store in Pittsburgh that specializes in women's designer clothing, jewelry, and accessories, consistently ranked by Esquire magazine as one of the top 20 specialty stores in the country for excellence in men's tailored clothing, made-to-measure suits, custom shirts, great sportswear, and accessories. Laramore's shop online at laramores.com or in-store downtown Pittsburgh. So, Jane, this has been a really interesting career path and exciting to hear you talk about it. You can tell the passion and the desire that you have to succeed in this space. Let's go the other direction and talk about when maybe you were a BSer, when you were a tough boss or a difficult employer, or maybe you just didn't communicate as well as you could have. What did you do to fix it that might help our audience?
Well, I do remember there was an incident in one of the museums that I worked, where I went to see a a show with my immediate boss. It was actually a theater show called Sarah the Scientist. And it was all about empowering girls to be scientists and women. And I was so inspired by this play that as my boss and I walked back to the museum, I kind of like took him on. I took him on about like all the things that I felt were just wrong with, being a woman in the Science Center. And frankly, I think I had a point. I mean, actually, women were paid less than men at the time in the same positions. I'm hoping that has changed in the Science Center field. But it was totally the inappropriate time and place to do it. It was not, I should have thought about it. And I was actually kind of moving on an emotional high rather than actually thinking it through. And it just, that did not go well. Because then he kind of lost trust in me because he had championed me for so long. And that was probably a mistake. And I kind of regret that. So yeah, that was a while ago. So as far as kind of overstating the truth, let's say, or overstating things, I try not to do that. I count Fred Rogers as a mentor. And since knowing him, I try to be my honest self because that's what he would always say, just be your honest self. And I do find myself catching myself because in some ways being an executive director is also being a little bit of a salesperson, being optimistic, looking through rose-colored glasses. And every once in a while, I think that I have to catch myself and really just tell the truth. Like look at it the way it is and just be your honest self and kind of be honest with the people around you. And if it's bad news, it's bad news. So yeah, I tend to try to not oversell, and just really be straightforward. Because in some ways that actually, then again, you have trust, right? You have trust with the funders, you have trust with your board, you have trust with your employees, you have trust with the management team. I think it's just the right way to do it.
When you had that instance where you were talking to the boss and it wasn't necessarily the right time and maybe not the exact right delivery, and you said you thought that he lost some trust in you because he had been championing you. Let's talk about that because I have a similar experience. I don't necessarily need to bring up, but just a very similar situation. And I often wonder, it changed me as a leader because now I try to think of that when someone makes the same type of mistake around me. I'm human, and you also have to be a strong leader and realize, well, maybe there is a violation of trust there. Let me keep an eye on it. But I also don't want to just throw someone out from the trust circle because of one time.
Right.
So talk about that a little bit more, because you also said something that really rings true to me. When this happened to me, it was the same type of thing. We had just had this exhilarating big deadline hit, and I happened to be in a situation with the boss where there was more freedom to talk, and we were both really emotionally high. And I said a couple of critical things that they couldn't handle. And so same thing. Talk about that. Has it impacted you on the other end now as the leader?
Oh, yeah. I think that that's really true. I mean, you have to really realize that people have other things going on in their lives. And it's the thing that I try to remember when someone disappoints me, or things aren't going the way you want them to go, or somebody that you really just have really a lot of faith in lets you down. I think you just have to stand back and say, people have other things going on, we all have things, right? We have aging parents, we have kids, and we have husbands and wives and spouses and partners and, just name it. There's so many things. We have health issues, mental health issues, and people are complex. And that's what's great about the world, right? So I think you just have to kind of have a little bit. I hope I have enough compassion to stand back and say, okay, what's going on? So it's kind of interesting because you walk a line between being a manager, but also trying to be close to the people you manage. So that's actually, I think, where the problem sometimes comes is giving people, you want to be close, but you also want to have some distance. So you have some perspective. It's a very, I think management's kind of interesting in that way.
It is.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I try to always remember, is that people lead very complex lives, and it doesn't end when they come in the museum door. They're just the same person with the same complexities. And I know that from my own personal life too. I mean, there's a lot of complexity. So
hear more of my interview with Jane Werner on part 2 of the No BS Marketing Show. Thanks for joining us for the No BS Marketing Show, brought to you by Laramore's Men's and Women's Designer Clothing. Free shipping, free returns. Shop men's and women's designer clothing, shoes, accessories, jewelry, and more online at laramores.com or in-store downtown Pittsburgh. Visit masssolutions.biz for show notes, plus additional marketing and messaging resources like our No BS Marketing Weekly Update. Sign up and receive timely, valuable ideas to improve your marketing and transform your message. Again, visit masssolutions.biz. Remember, ask yourself, what's the big idea? And build your story around the answer. It's all about bold solutions